Sometimes the most ordinary nights become the ones that define us. Sarah Martinez had no idea that covering a colleague's shift would force her to choose between her own survival and doing what's right. In the sterile halls of Memorial Hospital's ICU, where life and death decisions happen every hour, she would discover that the hardest choices aren't always medical ones. What started as just another exhausting night shift would spiral into a web of corruption, courage, and consequences that would shake the foundation of everything she believed about justice. Sometimes standing up means everything falls down first.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
The fluorescent lights in Memorial Hospital's ICU hummed with their familiar electrical buzz as Sarah Martinez clocked in for what should have been her night off. At 29, she had the kind of tired eyes that spoke of too many double shifts and not enough sleep, but her hands remained steady and sure, the hands of someone who had learned to save lives while barely managing to save herself. 3 years had passed since the car accident that claimed her husband Roberto's life, leaving Sarah to navigate single motherhood while maintaining her demanding career as a critical care nurse. The insurance settlement had covered the funeral expenses and some of Roberto's medical bills, but it hadn't been enough to eliminate the crushing debt that had accumulated during his 3-month fight for survival. Every extra shift Sarah picked up brought her one step closer to financial stability, one step closer to giving her 7-year-old son Miguel the security he deserved. "Thanks for covering, Sarah," whispered Janet, the day nurse whose sick daughter had created this unexpected opening. "Emma's fever spiked this afternoon, and my babysitter canceled at the last minute." Sarah nodded, already mentally calculating how this extra shift would affect her carefully balanced budget. The overtime pay would help with Miguel's upcoming school field trip, but it also meant another night away from her son, another evening when he would fall asleep wondering why Mommy was always helping other people's families instead of being home with him. The ICU floor felt different at night, quieter but somehow more intense. The beeping of monitors created a rhythmic symphony that experienced nurses learned to interpret like musicians reading music sheets. Changes in tone, variations in rhythm, the subtle differences that could signal improvement or crisis. Tonight, Sarah was assigned to the most critical wing, where Dr. David Hawthorne made his rounds with the precision of a military general and the warmth of a winter storm. Dr. Hawthorne had been at Memorial for 15 years, long enough to have trained half the current medical staff and intimidated the other half. His reputation for medical excellence was matched only by his reputation for being impossibly demanding, particularly with the nursing staff. Sarah had managed to stay largely beneath his radar, but tonight felt different. The other nurses spoke of him in hushed tones, sharing stories of impossible demands, public humiliations, and the kind of professional cruelty that could destroy careers with a single unfavorable evaluation. At 9:30 p.m., Dr. Hawthorne swept into the ICU with his usual air of controlled urgency. Sarah watched from behind the nurse's station as he moved from room to room, checking on patients with methodical thoroughness. She noticed how different his demeanor was with patients compared to his interactions with staff. Gentle, reassuring, taking time to explain procedures and answer questions with infinite patience. "Nurse Martinez?" he called sharply during his examination of Mrs. Patterson, a 70-year-old woman recovering from emergency surgery. "What's Mrs. Patterson's current pain medication schedule?" Sarah quickly consulted the chart. "She's receiving morphine every 4 hours as needed, last dose administered at 8 p.m. She rated her pain as a 3 out of 10 at that time." "And you didn't think to assess her comfort level when you came on shift?" The criticism stung, particularly because Sarah had been planning to check on all her patients once she finished reviewing the charts. "I was just completing my initial review, Dr. Hawthorne. I plan to do my assessments after." "Plans are worthless if they don't prioritize patient comfort," Mrs. Patterson has been lying here for an hour and a half since your shift has begun, potentially in pain while you've been doing paperwork." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. Dr. Hawthorne was technically correct that she should have checked on patients immediately, but his public criticism felt disproportionate to the situation. More importantly, Mrs. Patterson didn't appear to be in distress. She was sleeping peacefully. Her vital signs were stable. At 11 p.m., Rosa Guerrera began her cleaning rounds. At 52, Rosa moved through the hospital halls with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that her work, while largely invisible to most of the medical staff, was essential to maintaining the sterile environment that prevented infections and promoted healing. Rosa had been part of the Memorial Hospital cleaning crew for 6 years, arriving at 10 p.m. each night to begin the meticulous process of sanitizing patient rooms, corridors, and common areas. Sarah was updating medication records when she heard Dr. Hawthorne's voice cutting through the quiet atmosphere like a blade. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The harsh tone made Sarah's stomach tighten. She looked up to see Dr. Hawthorne standing in the doorway of room 15, where Mr. Davidson was recovering from cardiac bypass surgery. Rosa stood frozen beside her cleaning cart, crutching a mop handle like a lifeline. I cleaned the room, doctor," Rosa stammered, her accent thick with nervousness. "During visiting hours, while I'm trying to examine my patient? Do you have any concept of sterile procedure, of patient privacy?" Sarah watched as Rosa's face flushed red with embarrassment. The Davidson family, Mr. Davidson's wife, their adult daughter, and teenage grandson, shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something unfair. "I'm sorry, doctor. I'll come back later." "No, you won't just come back later. You'll explain to Mr. Davidson's family why their father's recovery might be compromised because you don't understand basic hospital protocol." The cruelty of the moment hit Sarah like a physical blow. Rosa had been cleaning the bathroom area of the room, not the immediate vicinity of Mr. Davidson's bed. The patient himself appeared to be sleeping peacefully. More importantly, Rosa had been cleaning that room at the same time every night for months. Dr. Hawthorne knew this. This wasn't about protocol or patient care. This was about power, about humiliation, about putting someone in their place for reasons that had nothing to do with Rosa's job performance. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists as she watched Rosa apologize profusely to the Davidson family, her dignity being stripped away piece by piece in front of strangers. Mrs. Davidson looked particularly uncomfortable, clearly recognizing the injustice but uncertain about how to intervene.
The incident with Rosa gnawed at Sarah throughout the rest of her shift. She had seen Dr. Hawthorne be demanding before, had heard stories from other nurses about his exacting standards, but what happened in room 15 crossed the line that had nothing to do with medical excellence. The deliberate public humiliation, the implied threat to Rosa's employment, the way he had forced her to apologize to strangers for doing her job, it all pointed to something darker than professional rigor. As Sarah continued her rounds, checking on patients and updating medical records, she found herself paying closer attention to Dr. Hawthorne's interactions with different staff members. She noticed how his tone changed depending on who he was addressing. Respectful with other physicians, professionally demanding with licensed nurses, and consistently harsh with support staff, particularly those whose English was accented or whose positions were most vulnerable. The pattern was subtle, but unmistakable when Sarah started looking for it. Dr. Hawthorne questioned the competence of housekeeping staff in ways that he never questioned other medical professionals. He demanded that orderlies repeat instructions in perfect English, but never made similar demands of residents whose first language also wasn't English. He found fault with support staff in ways that seemed designed to create documentation of poor performance, rather than improve hospital operations. At 2 a.m. during her break, Sarah found herself in the staff lounge, stirring instant coffee and trying to process the uneasiness that had settled over her. The small room with its mismatched furniture and flickering fluorescent light felt like a sanctuary compared to the intensity of the ICU floor. She was surprised to find Rosa there, sitting in the corner with her head in her hands, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "Rosa, are you okay?" The older woman looked up quickly, wiping her eyes. "Oh, Nurse Sarah, I fine. Just tired." But I could see she wasn't fine.
Rosa's hands were trembling, and there was a defeated quality to her posture that spoke of more than physical exhaustion. "What Dr. Hawthorne did tonight wasn't right," Sarah said gently, sitting across from Rosa. "You were just doing your job, following the schedule that's been approved by hospital administration." Rosa's eyes filled with tears again. He said he'd report me to supervisor and say I know professional, that I interfere with patient care." Her voice broke slightly. "I need this job, Nurse Sarah. I have 4 children. Maria, 16, wants to go to college. Carlos is 14, good student, but needs new shoes, new clothes. The little ones, they need so much." She paused, struggling to maintain composure. "My husband Jorge, he work construction when he can, find work, but it not steady. Sometimes good months, sometimes no work for weeks. This job, it's steady. Same schedule, same pay every week. If I lose job..." The fear in Rosa's voice was palpable, and Sarah felt familiar anger building in her chest. She understood Rosa's terror because she lived with similar economic anxiety every day. The difference was that Sarah had professional credentials that gave her some protection. Rosa's position was far more precarious. "Has this happened before?" Sarah asked carefully. She hesitated, glancing toward the door, as if Dr. Hawthorne might appear. "Sometimes he get angry when we cleaning during his rounds, say we interrupt important work, that we no understand medical procedures. But tonight in front of the family..." She shook her head. "I so embarrassed." "The family didn't think that, Rosa. I could see it on their faces. They knew what was happening wasn't right." Sarah reached across the table and touched Rosa's hand. "You have nothing to be embarrassed about. What he did was wrong." "But he is doctor, important man. Who believed cleaning lady with broken English?" The resignation in Rosa's voice struck Sarah to her core. How many times had Rosa endured this treatment in silence? How many other support staff members had been bullied into submission by someone who held their livelihoods in his hands? Over the next few days, Sarah began paying closer attention to interactions between Dr. Hawthorne and hospital support staff. What she observed painted a disturbing picture of systematic harassment and intimidation. Luis Morales, an orderly who had worked at Memorial for 3 years, was consistently subjected to criticism that bordered on ethnic harassment. Dr. Hawthorne questioned his ability to understand medical terminology, demanded that he repeat instructions multiple times, and frequently made comments about language barriers. Yet Sarah observed that Luis was bilingual, articulate, and more knowledgeable about hospital procedures than many newer nursing assistants. Maria Santos, a nursing assistant in the cardiac unit, had been written up twice in the past month for communication issues and failure to follow protocol. When Sarah discreetly inquired about specifics, she discovered they involved minor infractions that would normally be addressed through informal coaching rather than formal disciplinary action. Most disturbing was what she learned about Carmen Rodriguez, a former cleaning supervisor who had left Memorial abruptly 6 months earlier. According to staff rumors, Carmen had raised concerns about irregularities in cleaning and maintenance schedules for certain areas of the hospital. Shortly afterwards, she began receiving negative performance reviews and pressure to accept a demotion. Rather than fight the systematic harassment, Carmen had resigned. The pattern was clear and deeply troubling. Dr. Hawthorne was targeting support staff members, particularly those from Latino backgrounds, with a campaign of professional harassment designed to force them out of their positions. But Sarah was about to discover that Dr. Hawthorne's abuse was just the tip of the iceberg, and that the corruption at Memorial Hospital ran deeper than anyone imagined. Sarah's growing awareness of Dr. Hawthorne's harassment pattern might have remained just a source of professional concern, but what she witnessed during her Thursday night shift the following week changed everything.
She was working another unexpected overtime shift, covering for a colleague with COVID. The ICU was quieter than usual, with only 3 patients requiring intensive monitoring. At approximately 11:30 p.m., while updating patient charts, Sarah heard voices coming from Dr. Hawthorne's office at the end of the corridor, connecting the ICU to the administrative wing. The voices were speaking in urgent, hushed tones that suggested secrecy rather than routine hospital business. Sarah's curiosity was piqued, but she initially dismissed it as probably a consultation with another physician. It was only when she heard Rosa's name mentioned that her attention became focused and concerned. "The Rosa problem is becoming more complicated than we anticipated," she heard Dr. Hawthorne say. his voice carrying clearly down the quiet corridor. She's been asking questions about the late-night deliveries, and Luis mentioned that she's been keeping notes about unusual activities in the loading dock area. Sarah's blood ran cold. Rosa had mentioned seeing unusual activity during her late-night cleaning rounds, but Sarah had assumed it was routine hospital business. How much does she actually know? The second voice belonged to someone Sarah didn't recognize, a man with a slight accent that she couldn't immediately place. Probably nothing concrete, but she's observant, and she's been here long enough to recognize patterns. The bigger concern is that she's documenting what she sees. If she decides to take her concerns to administration, or worse, to outside authorities, we could have a serious problem. Then we need to accelerate the timeline for her removal. Sarah felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet. They were discussing Rose's termination, not as a personnel decision based on job performance, but as a strategic move to eliminate a potential threat. I've already begun documenting performance issues, unreliability, communication problems that affect patient care, failure to follow established protocols. I should have enough to justify termination within the next week or two. Good. The less time she has to ask questions or share her observations with other staff members, the better. What about the other housekeeping staff? Luis is already on thin ice. I've been building a case against him for months. Carmen was smart enough to leave voluntarily when she realized which way the wind was blowing. The rest are either too new to have noticed anything unusual or too scared to ask questions. Sarah pressed herself against the wall outside Dr. Hawthorne's office, her heart pounding. The conversation revealed a level of calculated cruelty that went far beyond workplace harassment. Dr. Hawthorne wasn't just bullying support staff. He was systematically eliminating potential witnesses to something that required concealment. The new supply chain we established through the emergency procurement process has been very effective. The documentation looks completely legitimate, and the quantities are within reasonable parameters for a hospital of this size. As long as we can maintain operational security, the last thing we need is an inventory audit or questions from the pharmacy board about our medication usage patterns. Sarah's mind reeled as the implications began to sink in. Emergency procurement, inventory audits, medication usage patterns. They were talking about pharmaceutical supplies, about quantities and documentation that needed to appear legitimate while concealing something that clearly wasn't. The Miami buyers are getting impatient. They're threatening to find another supplier if we can't increase volume by the end of the month. Volume isn't the issue. It's maintaining the appearance of routine hospital operations while diverting sufficient quantities to meet demand. We're already pushing the limits of what we can explain as normal usage. Drug diversion. She had heard about it in nursing school and had attended training sessions about recognizing signs of healthcare workers stealing medications. But what she was overhearing suggested something far more sophisticated than an individual with an addiction problem. Then we need to consider expanding the operation to the other hospitals in the network, Dr. Hawthorne said. I have contacts at Presbyterian and St. Mary's who might be interested in a partnership arrangement. That increases our exposure exponentially. More people, more documentation, more opportunities for mistakes. It also increases our profits exponentially, and it spreads the risk across multiple facilities, making it less likely that any single investigation could expose the entire operation. Sarah realized she was listening to the planning stages of a multi-hospital pharmaceutical theft ring. Dr. Hawthorne wasn't just stealing medications from Memorial Hospital. He was coordinating with accomplices to establish a regional network for diverting prescription drugs, particularly opioids and other controlled substances that commanded high prices on the black market. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, revealing details about false documentation, forged prescriptions, and a distribution network that extended from Miami to Atlanta. Most disturbing were references to emergency protocols that allowed them to order large quantities of medications without usual oversight procedures, supposedly in response to COVID-related supply chain disruptions. As the voices began moving toward the office door, Sarah realized she needed to get back to her station before being discovered. She made it quickly but quietly back to the nurse's station, her mind racing with implications. Rosa wasn't being targeted for harassment because of her ethnicity or position. She was systematically destroyed because she had observed activities that could expose a criminal conspiracy involving theft of millions of dollars worth of pharmaceutical supplies. Dr. Hawthorne's pattern of targeting support staff wasn't about racism or workplace harassment. It was about eliminating potential witnesses and maintaining operational security for a sophisticated criminal operation. Sarah was about to make a choice that would put everything she cared about at risk, because sometimes doing the right thing means sacrificing everything you've worked for.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The weight of what Sarah had discovered pressed down on her for the remainder of her shift and followed her home as dawn broke over the city. Miguel was still asleep when she arrived at her mother's house to pick him up, giving her precious minutes to sit in her car and try to process the impossible situation. 3 years of rebuilding her life after Roberto's death had taught her the value of stability, of not taking unnecessary risks, of protecting what little security she had managed to create. The extra shifts, the careful budgeting, the small sacrifices that added up to the possibility of a better future, all of it could be destroyed if she made the wrong choice. But as she watched Miguel through the window, still in his pajamas and eating cereal while his grandmother prepared his lunch, Sarah realized her choice wasn't just about protecting her own family's security. Rosa had 4 children who depended on her income. How many patients might be harmed if medications intended for their care were being diverted? How many other healthcare workers might be targeted? The drive to Miguel's school was quiet, but Sarah could feel her son's eyes on her in the rearview mirror. At 7 years old, he had developed an uncanny ability to sense when his mother was troubled. "Mommy, are you sad?" he asked as they pulled into the school parking lot. "No, mijo, not sad, just thinking about work. Do you have to help more sick people today?" The innocence of the question struck Sarah with unexpected force. Miguel's understanding of her job was simple and pure. She helped sick people get better. She made sure they were safe and comfortable. How could she explain that some of the people she worked with were causing harm rather than preventing it? "I'm trying to figure out the best way to help some people who are in trouble," she said carefully. Miguel nodded solemnly. "Sometimes helping is hard, but you always do the right thing." The faith in his voice was both inspiring and terrifying. Miguel's belief in his mother's moral courage was absolute, but Sarah wasn't sure she deserved that level of trust. After dropping Miguel at school, Sarah drove to a coffee shop across town where she could think without constant reminders of hospital politics. She ordered a large coffee and found a quiet corner table where she could begin documenting everything she had observed and overheard. The list was longer than expected. Rosa's harassment and systematic targeting of other support staff members, late-night conversations about pharmaceutical diversion and black market sales, references to false documentation and emergency procurement processes, coordination with criminal contacts in other cities, and plans to expand to additional hospitals. As she wrote, Sarah began to understand the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy she had uncovered. This wasn't a single corrupt doctor stealing medications for personal profit. This was an organized criminal enterprise that used Memorial Hospital's pharmaceutical supply chain as a front for large-scale drug trafficking with connections across state lines involving multiple healthcare facilities. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Rosa's name. "Hello, Rosa? Nurse Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I need to ask you something." Rosa's voice was strained, more anxious than Sarah had ever heard it. "Of course, what's wrong?" "This morning, my supervisor, she called me to meeting. Say, there have been complaints about my work, about my attitude with medical staff. She say Dr. Hawthorne report that I interfere with patient care, that I argue when he give me directions."
Sarah's stomach dropped. Dr. Hawthorne was moving faster than expected to implement Rosa's termination. "That's ridiculous, Rosa. I was there that night. You weren't arguing or interfering with anything. You were doing your job exactly as you're supposed to." "But supervisor, she say there are other complaints too, from different nurses, different doctors. Say I have pattern of problems with authority that I no follow hospital protocols." The systematic nature of the character assassination was breathtaking in its cruelty and effectiveness. Dr. Hawthorne hadn't just filed a single complaint, he had orchestrated a campaign of false reports designed to create the appearance of chronic performance problems that would justify immediate termination. "Rosa, listen to me carefully. These complaints are not legitimate. They're part of something bigger that has nothing to do with your job performance." "I know understand." Sarah took a deep breath, realizing she had reached a point where staying silent was no longer an option. Rosa deserved to know why she was being targeted. "I think Dr. Hawthorne is involved in something illegal, something that involves stealing medications from the hospital. I think you're targeted because you've observed activities that could expose what he's doing." The silence stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been disconnected. "Rosa, are you still there?" I hear you. You think Dr. Hawthorne is criminal?" "I think Dr. Hawthorne is part of a criminal conspiracy that involves pharmaceutical theft and probably other illegal activities. I think everyone who has been targeted, you, Carmen Rodriguez, Maria Santos, Luis, has been targeted because they observed something that could expose the operation." "But how you know this?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that sharing details would make Rosa a co-conspirator in whatever action they decided to take next. "I overheard a conversation between Dr. Hawthorne and someone else. They were discussing the need to eliminate potential witnesses, including you specifically. They talked about pharmaceutical theft, about falsifying documentation, about selling stolen medications to criminal contacts in other cities." Rosa was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new quality, not fear, but determination. "I know something was wrong," she said quietly. "For months I see things that no make sense. Deliveries at strange hours, boxes that go to storage rooms instead of pharmacy, people in expensive cars meeting with Dr. Hawthorne in parking lot after midnight." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Rosa hadn't just been an accidental witness. She had been conducting her own informal investigation for months. "What kind of things did you see?" "Every Tuesday and Friday night, same white van come to loading dock at 3 a.m. Same two men, always wearing hospital scrubs, but I never see them during regular hours. They bring boxes in, take different boxes out. Dr. Hawthorne, he always dared to watch, sometimes Dr. Williams from the pharmacy too." Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of pharmacy. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the conspiracy was broader than initially understood. Dr. Williams had been at Memorial for over a decade, was respected throughout the medical community, and had personally helped Sarah navigate the complexities of Roberto's medication regimen. The betrayal felt personal and devastating. "Rosa, do you have any documentation of what you observed? Notes, photographs, anything that could serve as evidence?" I keep small notebook, write down dates, times, what I see. My husband George, he work in pharmaceutical warehouse before construction. He teach me about different types of medication, different packaging systems. Some of the boxes I see, they have wrong labels for hospital pharmacy. Right medication, but wrong distribution codes, wrong lot numbers. Sarah realized Rosa possessed not just observational evidence, but technical knowledge that could help expose the sophisticated pharmaceutical theft operation. Her husband's background had given her expertise to recognize discrepancies invisible to most other hospital employees. "Rosa, this information could be the key to stopping them and protecting you and other people who have been targeted. But it's also very dangerous if they know you have this kind of detailed evidence." "They already tried to destroy me," Rosa replied, and Sarah could hear anger building in her voice. "They make up lies about my work, about my attitude, about my interactions with patients. They try to make me look like a bad employee who deserved to be fired. If I do nothing, I lose my job and my children suffer. If I fight back, maybe I lose my job anyway, but at least the truth comes out." The courage in Rosa's voice reminded Sarah of something she had almost forgotten in her fear and uncertainty, that fighting back wasn't necessarily more dangerous than remaining silent. Dr. Hawthorne's systematic elimination of potential witnesses meant that doing nothing would only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. If we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. We need evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away, and we need to take it to people who can't be bought or intimidated. What do you mean? I mean, we need to document everything we can about the criminal operation, and then we need to take that evidence to the FBI. What Sarah discovered next would force her to choose between her own safety and exposing a corruption that reached the highest levels of the hospital. But the real shock would come from discovering who she could and couldn't trust.
Sarah's first contact with the FBI came through a phone call to the Tampa field office's public corruption hotline. The automated system directed her through menu options before connecting her with Special Agent Maria Santos, whose calm, professional demeanor immediately put Sarah at ease. "I understand you want to report suspected criminal activity at a healthcare facility," Agent Santos said after Sarah provided basic information about herself and her employment at Memorial Hospital. "Yes, but this isn't just about healthcare fraud. I think there's a sophisticated criminal organization operating out of the hospital, involving pharmaceutical theft, falsified documentation, and systematic elimination of potential witnesses." Sarah spent 30 minutes providing Agent Santos with a detailed overview of what she had observed and overheard. Agent Santos asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated both her expertise in healthcare fraud investigations and her understanding of the personal risks that whistleblowers faced. "What you're describing is consistent with several ongoing investigations we have into pharmaceutical diversion networks operating through healthcare facilities in Florida and Georgia," Agent Santos explained. "These organizations have become increasingly sophisticated, often involving multiple hospitals, fake emergency procurement protocols, and systematic intimidation of potential witnesses." "So this isn't isolated to Memorial Hospital?" "Based on your information, it sounds like Memorial might be part of a larger network. The references you overheard to operations in Miami, to coordination with other hospitals, and to expansion plans suggest a regional criminal enterprise rather than isolated local corruption." The scope was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because the FBI was already aware of similar operations and had experience investigating them. Terrifying because it confirmed that she and Rosa were taking on not just a few corrupt individuals, but a sophisticated criminal organization with extensive resources and connections. "We need concrete evidence to move forward with the formal investigation. Testimony about overheard conversations is helpful background, but we need documentation, financial records, physical evidence of stolen pharmaceuticals, or recordings of suspects discussing criminal activities. That kind of evidence would be very dangerous for a civilian to try to obtain." "You're absolutely right, which is why I want to discuss the possibility of you working with us in a more formal capacity. If you're willing to cooperate with our investigation, we can provide you with recording equipment, guidance on evidence collection, and most importantly, protection from retaliation." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. Agent Santos was asking her to become an undercover informant, to actively participate in gathering evidence that could result in federal criminal charges against some of the most powerful people at her workplace. What would that involve? It would involve continuing your normal work routine while wearing recording devices during interactions with the suspects. It would involve documenting specific instances of criminal activity, potentially photographing evidence, and maintaining detailed records that could be used in court proceedings. Agent Santos paused, giving Sarah time to process the magnitude of what was being discussed. "I need to be completely honest about the risks. These people have already demonstrated their willingness to destroy careers and potentially lives to protect their operation. If they discover that you're working with federal law enforcement, you could face serious retaliation that might extend beyond professional consequences." Sarah thought about Miguel, about her mother, about the fragile stability she had worked so hard to create. Everything she cared about could be destroyed if she made the wrong choice, or if the investigation went wrong. But she also thought about Rosa's fear, about other healthcare workers who had already been targeted, about patients who might be suffering because medications meant for their care were being diverted to criminals. If I agree to cooperate, what kind of protection can you provide? We can provide emergency contacts, surveillance support during high-risk operations, and relocation assistance if the situation becomes too dangerous. We can also coordinate with local law enforcement and hospital security to ensure your safety during the investigation.
And if something goes wrong, if they discover what I'm doing, then we move immediately to make arrests based on whatever evidence we've gathered up to that point, and we provide you with full witness protection services. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Agent Santos explaining legal processes involved in federal criminal investigations, the timeline for gathering sufficient evidence to obtain indictments, and support services available to cooperating witnesses and their families. By the time Sarah ended the call, she had committed to meeting with Agent Santos in person the following day to receive recording equipment and detailed instructions on how to safely gather evidence against Dr. Hawthorne and his associates. Over the next 3 days, Sarah and Rosa began the delicate process of documenting the criminal conspiracy while maintaining their normal work routines and avoiding suspicion. Sarah used her position as an ICU nurse to observe unusual patterns in pharmaceutical supply usage, to listen for conversations that might reveal additional details, and to identify other potential victims or witnesses. Rosa continued her systematic documentation of late-night deliveries and unusual activities, but now she was also wearing a small recording device provided by Agent Santos that could capture audio evidence of any conversations she might overhear. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night when Sarah was working another unexpected overtime shift and Rosa was conducting her usual cleaning rounds. At approximately 3:30 a.m., Sarah positioned herself in an empty patient room that offered a clear view of the loading dock area, following a plan she had developed with Agent Santos for observing the pharmaceutical delivery operations Rosa had been documenting. At exactly 3 a.m., the familiar white van Rosa had described pulled up to the loading dock. Sarah watched through high-powered binoculars as Dr. Hawthorne emerged from a side entrance, but this time he wasn't alone. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of pharmacy, was with him, along with 2 men Sarah didn't recognize, and a 4th person who made her heart sink with shock. Marcus Chen, the hospital's chief financial officer. Sarah had known Marcus personally since Roberto's hospitalization 3 years ago. He had been compassionate and helpful during the most difficult period of her life, working with her to establish payment plans for Roberto's medical expenses and connecting her with financial assistance programs that had prevented the family from declaring bankruptcy. Seeing him involved in the criminal conspiracy felt like a personal betrayal that went beyond professional disappointment. The unloading process was swift and professionally organized, confirming Rosa's observations about the systematic nature of the operation. Boxes of what appeared to be pharmaceutical supplies were transferred from the van into the hospital, but instead of going to the main pharmacy, they were taken to a storage facility in the basement that Sarah knew was supposed to be used exclusively for archived medical records. As Sarah documented the activities with camera equipment provided by Agent Santos, she realized she was witnessing something far more sophisticated than simple pharmaceutical theft. The coordination between multiple high-level hospital administrators, the timing that avoided normal security protocols, and the systematic nature all pointed to a criminal enterprise that had been planned and implemented over months or years. But the most shocking revelation came when Sarah was able to get close enough to hear portions of the conversation between the conspirators. "The Atlanta buyers are threatening to cancel their standing orders if we can't guarantee consistent monthly deliveries," she heard Dr. Williams say as the group moved closer to the building entrance. "Volume isn't the issue anymore. It's maintaining operational security. We're already at the limits of what we can explain as legitimate pharmaceutical usage for a hospital this size. Then we need to accelerate the expansion to the other facilities in the network. I have confirmed partnerships with contacts at Atlanta and St. Mary's, and we're in preliminary discussions with 2 hospitals in Jacksonville." Sarah realized she was documenting not just criminal activity at Memorial Hospital, but the planning stages of a multi-hospital pharmaceutical theft network that could potentially affect patient care across the entire region. What about the witness elimination protocol? Are we confident that potential problems have been neutralized? "Rosa Guerrero will be terminated by the end of the week.
I have sufficient documentation of performance issues to justify immediate dismissal, and her immigration status will prevent her from pursuing any legal challenges. What about other potential witnesses? Luis Morales is already scheduled for termination next month. Maria Santos accepted a position at another facility rather than fight the harassment. Carmen Rodriguez was successfully eliminated 6 months ago. We've been very effective at maintaining operational security through strategic personnel management. The casual way they discussed destroying people's lives was breathtaking in its cruelty. Sarah realized she was listening to a systematic program of witness elimination that had been ongoing for months, possibly years, and that had already destroyed the livelihoods of multiple healthcare workers whose only crime had been observant and conscientious. As the group dispersed and the loading dock area returned to normal, Sarah remained hidden in her observation position, documenting license plate numbers and recording detailed notes about everything she had witnessed. She had enough evidence to expose the criminal conspiracy, but she also realized that she and Rosa were now in immediate danger. Dr. Hawthorne's plan to terminate Rosa was moving forward, and if he discovered that Sarah had been investigating the operation, she would undoubtedly become the next target for elimination. Sarah's plan to expose the conspiracy would require her to risk everything, but the person who stepped forward to help her would be the last person she would expect.
The next morning brought news that confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the timeline they were facing. Rosa called before Sarah's shift began, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "They moved meeting up," Rosa said without preamble. "My supervisor called this morning. Say they need to see me at 2 p.m. today instead of next week. Say it about serious performance concerns that require immediate action." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Dr. Hawthorne was accelerating Rosa's termination, probably because he sensed that time was running out to eliminate potential witnesses before their activities attracted unwanted attention. "Rosa, we need to contact Agent Santos immediately. If they fire you today, you'll lose access to the hospital and won't be able to gather any additional evidence." "Already call Agent Santos. She say FBI not ready to make arrest yet. They need more evidence about financial records and distribution network. But she also say if I get fired today, investigation might have to proceed without key witness testimony." The impossible timing was devastating. The FBI needed more time to build a case strong enough to guarantee convictions, but Dr. Hawthorne's witness elimination program was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. What did Agent Santos suggest? She say maybe I should call in sick today, buy more time for investigation, but if I no show up for meeting with supervisor, they might fire me anyway for insubordination. Sarah realized Rosa was facing an impossible choice: attend the meeting and almost certainly be terminated, or avoid the meeting and still face termination, while also appearing to confirm the accusations of unreliability that Dr. Hawthorne had been building against her. "There might be another option," Sarah said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "What if you attended the meeting, but not alone?" "What you mean?" "I mean, what if someone else was there to witness whatever accusations they make against you? Someone who could testify that the performance issues they're claiming are fabricated." The plan Sarah and Rosa developed was risky but potentially effective. Sarah would request a meeting with the nursing supervisor at the same time as Rosa's disciplinary hearing, ostensibly to discuss concerns about workplace harassment that was affecting the morale and performance of the entire ICU staff. This would give her a legitimate reason to be in the administrative area during Rosa's meeting and potentially allow her to overhear and document the false accusations being made. At 1:30 p.m., Sarah made her way to the hospital's administrative wing, wearing the recording equipment Agent Santos had provided and carrying a folder of documentation about harassment incidents she had witnessed. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to maintain the calm, professional demeanor that had served her well throughout her nursing career. The administrative wing was busier than usual, with several meetings apparently taking place simultaneously. Sarah checked in with the receptionist and was told to wait in a small conference room adjacent to the office where Rosa's disciplinary hearing was scheduled. At exactly 2 p.m., Sarah heard Rosa's voice in the hallway. Speaking in the respectful but nervous tone she used when addressing hospital administrators. A few moments later, Dr. Hawthorne's distinctive voice joined the conversation, along with two other people Sarah recognized as Rosa's immediate supervisor in the hospital's human resources director. "Mrs. Guerrero, please have a seat. We are here to discuss some serious concerns about your job performance and your interactions with medical staff." Sarah positioned herself near the door of her conference room, hoping to catch as much of the conversation as possible while maintaining the appearance of waiting for her own meeting. "Over the past several weeks, we have received multiple complaints about your work quality, your adherence to hospital protocols, and your attitude towards supervisory staff." Dr. Hawthorne's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. I no understand. What complaints?" "Dr. Hawthorne has documented several instances where you interrupted patient care, failed to follow cleaning protocols, and showed disrespect for medical staff attempting to perform their duties." Sarah could hear the confusion and fear in Rosa's voice as she attempted to respond to accusations that bore no resemblance to her actual job performance or professional behavior. "I always follow protocols. I always respectful to medical staff. I no understand what I do wrong." Furthermore, the HR director continued, "We have concerns about your reliability and your ability to communicate effectively with other staff members. These language barriers and cultural differences appeared to be affecting your ability to function effectively in a professional healthcare environment." The casual racism of the comment made Sarah's blood boil, but it also provided her with exactly the kind of evidence that Agent Santos had said would be crucial for demonstrating the systematic nature of the harassment and witness elimination program. "I work here 6 years, never have complaints about my work, never have problems with other staff. Why now, all of a sudden, everyone have problem with Rosa?" It was Dr. Hawthorne who answered, and his response revealed the calculated cruelty behind the systematic destruction of Rosa's career. "Healthcare is a demanding field, Mrs. Guerrero. Sometimes people who seemed adequate in the past prove unable to meet evolving standards. Sometimes what appeared to be acceptable performance reveals itself to be substandard when viewed more carefully." Sarah realized she was listening to a masterclass in institutional gaslighting, designed to make Rosa doubt her own perceptions and accept responsibility for problems that didn't actually exist. "But I do same work, same way, every day. Nothing change except..." "Except what, Mrs. Guerrero?" Rosa hesitated, and Sarah could imagine her internal struggle between the desire to defend herself and the fear of making her situation worse by speaking too directly about what she had observed. "Nothing. I think maybe someone has wrong idea about my work. Mrs. Guerrero, we're trying to help you understand why your employment here is being terminated. If you can't acknowledge the performance issues that have been documented, then there's really nothing more to discuss." The finality of the statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. They weren't giving Rosa an opportunity to improve or address the alleged problems. They were simply announcing that her termination had already been decided.
"Please," Rosa's voice broke slightly. "I need this job. I have 4 children. I work hard. I do everything you ask. If I make mistakes, tell me what they are. I fix them." "The decision is final, Mrs. Guerrero. Your employment will be terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to gather your personal belongings and return your hospital identification." Sarah heard chairs being moved and footsteps indicating that the meeting was ending. In a few minutes, Rosa would be escorted out of the hospital, probably barred from returning and unable to gather any additional evidence about the criminal conspiracy that had targeted her for elimination. But as Sarah listened to the sound of Rosa being destroyed for the crime of being observant and conscientious, she made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of the investigation. She opened the door to her conference room and stepped into the hallway. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough to be heard by everyone involved in Rosa's termination. "I'm here for my meeting with administration, but I couldn't help overhearing this conversation. As the ICU nurse who works most closely with Mrs. Guerrero, I think there might be some misunderstandings about her job performance that need to be addressed." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Hawthorne's face went white, then red, as he realized that a witness to Rosa's systematic destruction had just identified herself and inserted herself into a process that was supposed to be confidential and one-sided. "Nurse Martinez," the HR director said carefully. "This is a private personnel matter that doesn't involve you." "Actually, it does involve me," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Mrs. Guerrero works in the ICU during my shifts. I'm in a position to observe her interactions with medical staff, her adherence to protocols, and her overall job performance. The complaints you're describing don't match anything I've witnessed." Dr. Hawthorne found his voice, and when he spoke, Sarah could hear the dangerous edge that he had witnessed him use against other staff members who had challenged his authority. "Nurse Martinez, you're out of line. This meeting doesn't concern you, and your input hasn't been requested." "But it should concern me," Sarah replied, looking directly at Dr. Hawthorne and seeing the recognition in his eyes that she was no longer just an observer, but an active threat to his operations. If good employees are being terminated based on false accusations, that affects the morale and functioning of the entire department. What happened next unfolded with the swift precision of a carefully orchestrated law enforcement operation, because unbeknownst to Dr. Hawthorne and his co-conspirators, Agent Santos had been coordinating with hospital security and local police throughout the investigation. The recording devices that Sarah and Rosa had been wearing during the disciplinary meeting had been transmitting directly to FBI surveillance teams positioned throughout the hospital. Dr. Hawthorne's admission that Rosa's termination was part of a systematic program to eliminate potential witnesses, combined with the evidence Sarah had gathered during the loading dock operation, provided Agent Santos with sufficient grounds for immediate arrests. As Dr. Hawthorne began to respond to Sarah's challenge with what would undoubtedly have been threats and intimidation, Agent Santos and 3 other federal agents appeared in the hallway, displaying their credentials and announcing that Dr. Hawthorne, Dr. Williams, and Marcus Chen were under arrest for conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, pharmaceutical theft, and witness tampering. The shock and confusion that followed revealed just how many hospital employees had suspected that something was wrong but had been too afraid to speak up. As news of the arrests spread through Memorial Hospital, Sarah found herself approached by dozens of colleagues who shared stories of suspicious activities they had observed, harassment they had witnessed, and good employees who had been mysteriously targeted for termination.
The FBI investigation ultimately revealed that the pharmaceutical theft ring had been operating for over 3 years, involving 6 hospitals across Florida and Georgia, and resulting in the theft of medications worth over $8 million. The stolen drugs had been sold to criminal organizations in Miami, Atlanta, and New York, contributing to the illegal drug trade that was devastating communities across the Southeast. The investigation's aftermath revealed layers of corruption that extended beyond what anyone had initially imagined. During the subsequent federal audit of Memorial Hospital's pharmaceutical records, investigators discovered that the theft operation had been systematically underdosing pain medications for post-surgical patients, substituting lower concentrations to mask the quantities being diverted for illegal sale. This revelation meant that hundreds of patients had suffered unnecessarily during their recovery periods, experiencing pain that could have been prevented if they had received the full-strength medications they had been prescribed. Most disturbing was the discovery that 37 healthcare workers had been systematically targeted for elimination over the previous 2 years, all because they had observed activities that could have exposed the criminal operation. The victims included nurses, orderlies, cleaning staff, and administrative personnel whose careers and reputations had been destroyed to protect a criminal conspiracy. Dr. Hawthorne was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Dr. Williams received 10 years. Marcus Chen, who cooperated with prosecutors, received 6 years and was required to make full restitution to the affected hospitals and patients. All 3 lost their professional licenses and faced additional civil lawsuits from patients whose care had been affected by the diverted medications. Sarah found herself testifying before a congressional subcommittee investigating healthcare fraud, sharing her story with lawmakers who were drafting legislation to strengthen whistleblower protections and improve oversight of pharmaceutical supply chains and healthcare facilities.
Nurse Martinez asked Senator Patricia Williams of Ohio, "What would you say to other healthcare workers who might be observing suspicious activities in their workplaces but are afraid to speak up?" Sarah thought carefully before answering, remembering her own fear and uncertainty during those first weeks when she was trying to decide whether to get involved or to protect her own security by staying silent. "I would tell them that silence isn't really protection. The criminal organizations that operate within healthcare facilities depend on our fear and our assumption that we're powerless to stop them. But they're also afraid that their crimes will be exposed, afraid that ordinary healthcare workers will refuse to accept corruption as normal, afraid that people will realize that we have more power than we think we do." The congressional testimony led to the passage of the Healthcare Integrity Protection Act, which established stronger safeguards for whistleblowers, increased penalties for pharmaceutical theft, and created new oversight mechanisms to prevent the kind of systematic witness elimination that had been used against Rosa and so many others. For Sarah, the aftermath was complicated by the media attention, the legal proceedings, and the emotional toll of learning how deeply the corruption had penetrated an institution she had trusted and respected. Hospital administration offered her a promotion to a supervisory position and praised her courage, but she found herself struggling with the betrayal of trust and the knowledge of how close Rosa and other victims had come to being completely destroyed. Rosa not only kept her job but was offered a position in the hospital's new compliance and oversight program, where her attention to detail and willingness to ask difficult questions were recognized as valuable assets rather than threats to be eliminated. More importantly, she had demonstrated to her 4 children that fighting back against injustice was possible even for people who seemed powerless within institutional hierarchies. "You know what I learned from this?" asked Rosa during one of their conversations in the staff lounge, now brightly lit and renovated as part of the hospital's efforts to improve working conditions and employee morale. "What's that?" "I learned that being invisible can be power if you use it right. For so long, I think being cleaning lady means being nobody important. But invisible person can see everything, can go everywhere, can notice things that important people miss because they think we no matter." Sarah smiled, recognizing the profound truth in Rosa's observation. The criminal conspiracy had been possible partly because the perpetrators had assumed that support staff were invisible, that their observations didn't matter, and that their voices wouldn't be heard even if they tried to speak up. "I also learned that doing right thing is not always safe thing, but safe thing is not really safe. If I stay quiet, maybe I keep job for little while, but eventually they find way to get rid of me anyway. And more people get hurt while I stay silent." 6 months after the trials concluded, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at Memorial Hospital. Agent Santos arrived during one of Sarah's night shifts, not on official business, but to share news about the broader impact of the investigation they had conducted together. "The evidence you and Rosa gathered didn't just stop the operation at Memorial. It provided us with the information we needed to identify and shut down pharmaceutical theft rings at 12 other hospitals across 5 states. We estimate that the total value of stolen medications recovered was over $25 million. The scope of the criminal network that had been dismantled was staggering, but Sarah found herself most interested in the human cost that had been prevented. How many people were they planning to target for elimination? Based on the documents we recovered from Dr. Hawthorne's personal files, they had identified 37 hospital employees across the network who had observed suspicious activities or asked inconvenient questions. Rosa was just the beginning. They were planning a systematic purge of potential witnesses that would have destroyed dozens of careers and families. Agent Santos pulled out a thick folder filled with letters and photographs. "I thought you might want to see these. They're thank you notes from some of the healthcare workers whose jobs and reputations were saved because you and Rosa were willing to speak up."
Sarah spent the next hour reading letters from nurses, orderlies, cleaning staff, and administrative personnel who had been targeted for elimination, but whose careers had been saved when the FBI investigation exposed the systematic nature of the witness elimination program. Many of the letters included photographs of families, children who would not have faced financial instability, spouses who would not have watched their partners destroyed by false accusations, parents who had been able to maintain their dignity and their ability to provide for their loved ones. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from a nurse at a hospital in Alabama who had read about her experience and was facing a similar situation involving suspected corruption in her own workplace. She was asking for advice, for guidance, for the courage to do what she knew was right, even though it might cost her everything she had worked to build. Sarah spent considerable time crafting her response, drawing on everything she had learned about the courage required to challenge institutional corruption and the support systems necessary to sustain that challenge over time. "You are not powerless," she wrote. "You're scared, which is completely rational given what you're facing. But being scared and being powerless are not the same thing. The people who are abusing their authority are counting on your fear to keep you silent, but they're also afraid. Afraid that their crimes will be exposed, afraid that their victims will find allies, afraid that ordinary people like you will refuse to accept that corruption is inevitable." Sarah had learned that heroism wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about choosing to act despite legitimate concerns about personal consequences. It was about recognizing that the alternative to taking risks was allowing others to continue suffering. It was about understanding that institutional corruption could only persist when individuals decided their personal security was more important than collective justice. Most importantly, she had learned that courage was contagious. Rosa's willingness to document suspicious activities despite the risks inspired Sarah to investigate further. Sarah's decision to challenge Rosa's termination had encouraged other employees to come forward with their own observations. Agent Santos's professional expertise had provided them with the tools and protection needed to gather evidence safely. The night shift at Memorial Hospital continued its familiar rhythm of life-saving work, but now with new protocols designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had flourished under Dr. Hawthorne's leadership. Transparency requirements, anonymous reporting systems, and regular oversight audits had been implemented to ensure that concerns about corruption or harassment could be raised without fear of retaliation. In the staff lounge, a small plaque had been installed. Memorial Hospital recognizes that the courage to speak truth to power comes from all members of our healthcare family. Every voice matters, every observation counts, every person has the right to a workplace free from retaliation for doing what is right. Below the plaque, a second inscription had been added. In recognition of Sarah Martinez, RN, and Rosa Guerrero, whose courage in exposing corruption and protecting their colleagues demonstrates that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. Sarah read those words every night when she took her break, and they reminded her that the most important battles for justice and dignity are often fought by ordinary people who simply refuse to accept that abuse and corruption are inevitable parts of institutional life. The investigation had taught her that corruption thrives not because corrupt people are particularly powerful, but because good people convince themselves that they are powerless to stop it. Sometimes the most ordinary nights become the ones that define us. And sometimes when we choose to stand up for others, we discover that we were never standing alone. The courage to do what's right exists in every workplace, every community, every situation where power is being abused and people are suffering in silence. It just takes one person willing to risk their own comfort and security to light the spark that can illuminate the darkness and inspire others to join the fight for justice and human dignity. Sarah had learned that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and choosing to act anyway, knowing that the alternative to taking risks is allowing others to continue suffering, and that the most ordinary people, in the most ordinary circumstances, have the power to change everything.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.